Chapter 4, Lesson 1 on the distributive property. Okay, so the distributive property states that to multiply a sum or difference by a number, you must multiply each term inside the parentheses by the number on the outside of the parentheses. Now let's take a look at what that looks like when we actually look at things. Just using symbols, we can say, well, if I have a letter A and I want to multiply it by the sum of B and C. According to our order of operations, normally I would do B plus C. But because I have variables, I can't add them together, so I must distribute to simplify it. So I do A times the B, that's the first term, and then A times the C. And since they're positive, it's going to be plus A times C. Okay, we can also multiply something by a difference. So if I'm subtracting B and C, I take A times B, and then A times C, and I get minus AC. Now an example with numbers is if I had 5 times 12 plus 4. Now according to our order of operations, we will normally just add inside of here. But later in this lesson, we'll look at why we use the distributive property when I have variables in the parentheses. But to show that I can use the distributive property, I would do 5 times 12 plus 5 times 4. And then I could say 5 times 12 is 60 plus 20, and my answer would be 80. All right, now let's talk for a little bit about what equivalent expressions mean. It's not too difficult of a definition. It is just expressions that have the same value. And this can look like a lot of different things in math. Let's take a look at some examples. One simple thing that I like to use for when we talk about equivalent expressions is money. So I could have a $1 bill, but that's also equal to 10 dimes. Those are two equivalent expressions. We can come up with lots of examples with money. I can also say, well, 2 plus 3 is equal to 5 times 1. Those two expressions are equivalent to each other. They have the same value. Well, that's all I'm doing when I use the distributive property. So I could say that I have 2 times 3 minus 8. Well, that's also equal to doing 2 times 3 and subtracting 2 times 8. So when I use the distributive property, I'm not changing values. I'm just writing an expression that is equivalent to the other expression. Now, we use this in order to simplify algebraic expressions. Algebraic expressions are when we have variables. So when I have variables, and I can simplify them using the distributive property by getting rid of my parentheses. And we'll look at some examples of these. But I want to get rid of those parentheses. So for example, if I have 8 times m minus 4, well, my problem now is that I cannot do the m minus 4. So I want to distribute. So I want to say, well, what if I do 8 times m? That gives me 8m. And then I do 8 times 4 is going to be minus 32. Now, when we simplify, the only time this gets a little tricky is when I have some negatives. So let's say I have negative 6 times x minus 5. Okay, first part, negative 6 times x, pretty simple, negative 6x. But now is when it gets a little tricky because I want to write it in simplest form. So I have negative 6 times 5, which is negative 30. So a lot of times we would say, oh, we do minus negative 30, which is okay to write, but we want to remember that minus and negative, zoom zoom, really means we're adding. So I want to write my final answer as negative 6x plus 30. There's another way that you can think about this distributive property with the negatives. Let's say I have negative 5 times x minus 2. So again, I'm going to distribute. Negative 5 times x is negative 5x. Now instead of keeping the subtraction sign and bringing it down automatically, I can think about them in terms of negative 5 times negative 2. And that gives me a positive 10. So instead of just bringing down the subtraction sign, I can say, but negative 5 times negative 2 is positive 10, which results in plus 10. I can do the same thing when I have a sum in my parentheses. So if I have negative 8 times y plus 3, I can say negative 8 times y is negative 8y. Negative 8 times positive 3 is negative 24. So instead of writing plus a negative 24, my final answer is just minus 24.